Okay, so now we're talking about the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And this is an agency that's under the Department of Interior at the federal level. And what they focus on is the threatened and endangered species across the United States. So Scott, what are these lists? Where do they come from? How do they exist?
So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for the Endangered Species Act. And under the Act, they are required to list individual species, whether they're threatened or endangered, or warrant candidacy, meaning they're still deciding. And those are the species that have, they're in dire straits of becoming extinct. Threatened species aren't quite as critical, but they're usually because of a trend of lack of habitat or a significant decline in their population, but it may not be as critical. Endangered species, there's critical timing with making some kind of conservation effort, otherwise they risk extinction.
So I know there's like hundreds of species listed. You know, I've seen them on the website, which, you know, we'll show you a sample of the website a little bit later. But do these lists change often? And it's like from year to year, like how many get added, how many get dropped off, or do they get dropped off?
You'd be surprised. So in California's a little different. In the United States, they have over 1,600 listed species as federally threatened or endangered. As the biologists, we are inundated with federal registry notices of every 5 years they have a review process where they review the species, how it's doing, and they'll have petitions for delisting certain species, and they'll have petitions for listing species. And so we track those pretty regularly because we got to make sure that we understand, you know, which species are coming up and which ones are going down. But generally, they don't change a whole lot. There'll be one or two. Recently, the bald eagle was delisted as a federally listed species, but it's still state listed. So federal and state lists are quite different, and they're different for different reasons.
So I know we're generally talking about endangered or threatened species, which means they're concerned about their habitat that they live in, right? But there's also habitat that's considered on the list, right? For that, and that doesn't have to do anything with the species, but the type of habitat, flora or whatever, right?
Yeah, so there's specific, like with the least Bell's vireo, which is an endangered species, it typically occurs in riparian areas, which are wooded areas along drainage features. So those are habitats that, as part of the listing process, the Army Corps, the Fish and Wildlife Service is required to designate critical habitat. And that kind of came about as a part of the consultation between federal agencies. So if you have a species that has designated critical habitat, and there's a federal nexus, so there's a drainage feature that flows through it, and now that critical habitat requires those two resource agencies to have a consultation, regardless of whether or not you're actually going to be impacting the species or the habitat.
We're going to talk about the consultation a bit, but just to kind of hopefully clarify, I don't believe a land developer actually makes an application to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Correct.
But it's the Army Corps who requests consultation?
That depends.
Okay.
That's why you hire us. So if you have a federal nexus, meaning there's two federal agencies that have to have a conversation, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does not require a permit. That consultation is usually spearheaded by the lead agency, such as the Army Corps of Engineers. So they would request consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service as part of their permit process. If you do not have a federal nexus, then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would require you to file for an incidental take permit, which is a very lengthy process, which requires the preparation of a habitat conservation plan. They always say it's easier to have a federal nexus than not. And so being in California, you have what we have is the multiple species habitat conservation plans, which are basically incidental take permits. So those are large plans over large areas. So you have to take that into consideration too as part of your planning process. Do you have one of those already established, or do you have to do your own separate Section 10 consultation?
So just explain what federal nexus means, or nexus. What does that mean in this
nexus
context?
Means that a federal agency has to take an action. So if there is a drainage feature on your project site and they have to impact it, then the Army Corps of Engineer has to take an action. They have to make a determination of what that impact is and what's the significance of that impact. When you have another federal agency, whether it's the Fish and Wildlife Service or SHPO with cultural resources, they now have an action that they have to take. So if you have a potentially endangered species on your property, they now have to take an action. So when you have two federal agencies that both have to take an action, that becomes, now that's your federal nexus.
Okay. So anyway, there is no application to file out and fill out, and I believe in most cases I've seen it is generally, as a land development, it's the Army Corps, the federal nexus, that is going to ask for the consultation. And we'll talk about that a little bit more.